Chapter 8. The Canoeists' Clue. It was a full half-minute before Nancy and George collected their wits. They had been badly shaken by the boat crash. Since no other craft was around, they assumed their motorboat had hit a rock. "Nancy!" George cried out. "The boat's filling with water!" "Yes, and Mr. Wheeler's unconscious." The girls realized it was futile to try to plug the hole in the boat. They must swim to shore and take Mr. Wheeler with them. At this part of the river, the bank was very dark. It was tree-lined and impossible for the girls to tell how deep the water was. Before going over the side, they tried to revive Mr. Wheeler. It was hopeless. By this time, the water on the floor of the tilted motorboat was 6 inches deep. "I'll see how far it is to the bottom here," Nancy offered. She eased herself into the water and disappeared. When she surfaced, she said, "It's over our heads. George, see if there's a flashlight in the boat's compartment." George yanked open the door. "Yes, there is," she replied. Nancy asked George if she would please hold it and light the way to shore. She would support Mr. Wheeler. "Can you ease him over the side and lay him on his back?" Nancy asked. "I'll try." George soon had him in the water. Nancy tucked one arm around Mr. Wheeler's neck to keep him afloat and held him up while she swam with her free arm. George stayed close beside her, holding the strong beam of the flashlight on the bank ahead. Fortunately, they were close enough to the shore so the swim was not too arduous. They reached it safely and carried the unconscious figure to a flat, open area where they again tried to revive him. It was useless. George and Nancy peered into the dark night, hoping to see lights from a house, but neither girl saw any. "I guess we'll have to yell for help," Nancy said. She began calling, but there was no response. George took up the cry, and the two friends thought their shouts would surely rouse Mr. Wheeler, but he lay still on the grass. "I'll SOS with the flashlight," Nancy said finally. "Maybe somebody will pick it up." She began. 3 dots, 3 dashes, followed by 3 dots. After waiting several seconds, the young sleuth repeated the distress signal. Suddenly the girls heard a hello from the water. "You in trouble?" a man's voice called. "Yes, our boat cracked up. We're here on shore with an injured man." "I'll be right there," the stranger promised. Within a few minutes, a canoe pulled up to the shore. In it were a couple who jumped out at once. The young man went over to Mr. Wheeler, got down on one knee, and felt the man's pulse. Meanwhile, the girl said, "We're Amy Cadmus and Art Munson. Art's a medical student." "Thank goodness for that," said George, and introduced herself and Nancy. Art quickly examined Mr. Wheeler, then said, "We must get this man to the Deep River Hospital immediately." "Is there a road near here?" Nancy asked. "No, there isn't. This area is almost a wilderness. I'll be glad to take the man to the hospital in our canoe. Amy, suppose you come with me. Later, I'll return for you girls. For Pete's sake, you're shivering." "Well, we're soaking wet," George said. "And of course Mr. Wheeler is too." "He's John Wheeler, a retired lawyer of Deep River," said Nancy. "Oh, really?" said Amy. "I know him." In Art's well-equipped canoe were 2 raincoats and a large tarpaulin. He handed a raincoat to each of the soaking wet girls. Mr. Wheeler was laid in the canoe and the tarpaulin placed over him. The canoeists paddled off, making fast time across the river. Nevertheless, for Nancy and George, the wait seemed interminable. At last, however, Art reappeared. As Nancy and George climbed into the canoe, Art said, "I called an ambulance as soon as we reached the other side." Amy said she would stay there and tell the intern what happened and who Mr. Wheeler is. Do you think he's going to be all right? Nancy asked. It's hard to say, the young medical student replied. He hadn't regained consciousness when I left him. George offered to take the extra paddle, and it was not long before they reached town. Amy was waiting for them on the dock. She said the ambulance had come and gone. Mr. Wheeler was still unconscious. Where are you girls staying? She asked. At the Longview Motel, Nancy replied. Art said he had a car nearby and offered to drive the girls home. Grinning, he added, Dr. Munson orders hot baths and a good night's sleep. Nancy and George laughed and said they would certainly obey his orders. As they headed for the motel, Amy said to George, How do you happen to have a boy's name? Or isn't George your real name? George smiled. It's my real name, all right. According to the story, my parents were so sure I was going to be a boy, they had picked out only the name George, so they decided to give it to me anyway. I like it, said Amy. Unusual names intrigue me. My sister, who is 18, has a friend whose name I love. It's Jodine. That is unusual, Nancy agreed. Is she called that? No, which I think is a shame. She's called Jody. Amy went on to say that Jody was a wonderful girl. I wish you could meet her while you're here. Her last name is Armstrong, and she lives on Birchwood Lane. That's the street alongside the high school. She has had the name Armstrong only since she was about 3 or 4 years old, when she was adopted. Nancy and George, interested at once, glanced at each other. Had they picked up a clue to Joanie Horton? Trying to sound nonchalant, Nancy asked, Was Jody adopted here in Deep River? Her present parents got her from an adoption society in the next town, I believe. I'd love to meet her, said Nancy. While we're here, could you introduce us? Amy said unfortunately both she and her sister were going out of town early the next morning on a vacation. But Jody would love to meet you just the same. Tell her you saw me and that I suggested you girls get together. Nancy was delighted with the information. She would certainly look up Jody Armstrong. By this time, the car had reached the motel. Nancy and George thanked Art and Amy for their kindness in taking care of Mr. Wheeler and for rescuing them. I'm sorry we won't see you again, said Nancy. Have a marvelous time on your vacation. I'm sure we will, said Amy. Too bad that Art won't be around here. This is the last day of his vacation. He's going back to medical school in New York City tomorrow. Nancy and George returned the raincoats to their kind donors, then walked into the motel lobby. Bess Marvin ran toward them. My goodness! What happened to you? You're all wet! Mrs. Thompson, who had risen from a chair, now reached the bedraggled girls. Bess and I have been dreadfully worried about you. Quickly, Nancy and George told what had happened. Mrs. Thompson insisted that they follow Art Munson's advice. As soon as you're in bed, I'll bring you some hot cocoa and cookies. It would taste mighty good, I admit, said Nancy. Bess offered to help Mrs. Thompson and went to her private kitchen. When the cocoa and cookies were ready, Bess carried them to the girls' room. While Nancy and George sat up in bed, sipping the hot, soothing cocoa, they told Bess about Jody Armstrong. At once, Bess had the same thought as Nancy and George. Do you think Jody Armstrong is really Joanie Horton? She asked excitedly. Let's go see her tomorrow, Nancy said. End of chapter 8.